Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 403rd meeting of the New York Comics and Picture-story Symposium. The symposium is an ongoing weekly series of free artist talks, completely open and accessible to the public on the subject of comics, visual narratives, or exploration of what picture stories have been or could be. Um, it was founded over a decade ago by Ben Catcher and receives funding for the invited presenters from the Will and Ann Eisner Family Foundation and the New School. One of what I feel like is the very special things about this series is that the talks are completely open to the invited artist. It's entirely up to them to give insight into their practice or interest in whatever format or on any subject that they wish, which I just feel like makes for an especially raw and inspiring series to have these more direct and personal conversations with artists who are working in visual narrative or sequential work. Um, let someone in here. My name is Lily Correa. I'm one of the organizers this fall, along with Ben Catcher, Austin English, and Bill Cardalopoulos. I am very excited to have Yara Elfouly be giving one of the talks for the series today. I had the pleasure of working with Yara while she was studying at Cal Arts, and I've had many conversations about picture stories of all kinds with Yara, and feel really lucky to engage with someone who is such an inventive thinker, reader, and drawer. Yara is one of the most deeply curious people that I've met in her thinking about comics and animation, and it makes me very excited to hear her talk tonight, which is titled Turning Corners Like Reading Pages, Comics as Tombs, Temples, and Mind Palaces. After her talk, it'll be open to a Q&A, so if you have a question in mind, keep it in your mind, keep it in your brain, or you can enter it into the chat at any time and we can come to it at the end. I will read Yara's bio and then hand it over to her. Um, Yara Elfouly works in both animation and comics. She was nominated for an Ignatz Award in 2022 for her comic Archaeologist Landings. And in 2023, she received an MFA in experimental animation at CalArts. She is currently a visiting assistant professor at Columbus College of Art and Design and is working on her ongoing web comic called Court Comicals. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Yara.
Hello. All right, let's get started. So, I'll do the little ritual of sharing my screen here. Okay, perfect. Full screen. All right. So, the title of this comic talk is Turning Corners Like Reading Pages, Comics as Tombs, Temples, and Mind Palaces. And little did I know how much digging, contemplation, and soul searching I would do when I picked it out. But alas, I should have known when I decided to present about unexpected encounters I've had with comics that I would be surprised along the way because, hey, the presentation turned into a comic. Would you look at that? At the same time, indulge me as I seek to mimic visual essays and the like, even if it's just in passing. So this talk will be divided into several unequal parts. So let's go to part one, the land, where metaphors will be in abundance. The first being that comics are gourds that I'm lucky to find while I'm out picking at art and forging a bit of life. They are not as regular an occurrence as I wish, so I sometimes imagine myself farming them, as in establishing seasonal rituals to sow sketches and guarantee a steady harvest of inked pages. While gourds are one of the earliest plants to be domesticated, comics are a special kind that hold similar properties and yet remain untamed and elusive. The similarities between comics and gourds being hard skin, old stuff, stories, and supper, good food for the soul, digestible at times, usually shaped like something to lug your enemy with, as old as civilization, and they can be used as door stoppers. My basket of comics that I've found, read, and made, created, now form survey markers that I can use to trace back to key moments that honestly didn't feel significant at all. Only in hindsight did these experiences bloom from the ground, and now they seem to hold too much significance. I'll be sharing some of them as if I were sitting by the fire, drinking and whittling at memories of anecdotes and fun facts. Part 2, the Art History Lecture Hall. I've encountered plenty of comics before my undergrad in painting and printmaking, and they were the kind that were clearly marketed and labeled as comics, graphic novels, and manga. They're low-hanging fruit that sustained me when I didn't know where to look for the more exotic type. They fed me and sheltered me. I'm eternally in their debt. However, they aren't where I will begin this journey, since a serious reflection of comics didn't begin during that time. Instead, it was during my many art history classes that seeds of something were planted in the deepest, darkest soils at the back of my mind. Art history was the perfect vessel to carry my initial theorizing about what comics could be. While it would be untrue to claim that the paintings we studied did not interest me, I was particularly fascinated with lectures that focused on ancient cultures and architectural spaces. And that's where I found my quote unquote first comic. Borobudur is a 9th century Buddhist temple in central Java, Indonesia. It has 9 stacked platforms, 6 square and 3 circular, in reference to the mandala, a geometric shape that represents the universe. There are 3 main levels representing the spiritual journey to nirvana, as one that starts in the material realm of earthly desires to a more formless space, square as earth and circle as heaven. And guiding the pilgrims through the corridors and stairways are over 2,600 relief panels, with more than half depicting narratives from Mahayana texts. It is not super surprising that I associated this building with what was familiar to me as an avid reader: comics. The parallels between the two is perhaps not even surprising at all. Panels look like windows. Opening a book mimics the act of opening a door. Gutters on the page parallel the spaces and architectural facades. Emanatas are the perched birds and hanging laundry you see on buildings. Even the vertical nature of common comic pages harkens back to towers. However, this wasn't what I was thinking at the time. Instead of reading comics as buildings, what if we were reading buildings as comics? The act of turning around the corner functioning as a comic book is a notion that sprung into my brain and remained like an obstinate tree in winter. The absolutely ordinary act of turning is transformed into a magical achievement. The building is a medium for storytelling, and the pilgrim is a character within that story. After Borobudur, buildings would continue to shape how I look and think about comics and stories. And during an independent study, my professor, shout out to Professor Dalal, told me about a building that speaks, and it was Al Hamra. It is an Andalusian palace and fortress complex in Granada, Spain, that is constructed on a plateau overlooking the city. It was built during the 13th and 14th century. Al Hamra in Arabic means the red one, due to the outer wall's reddish color. However, it is perhaps a fitting adjective for a building that has seen its share of destruction, from deliberate damage by Charles V to rebuild parts of the building in an Italianate style, or French forces blowing up some of the towers during some battle, or natural disasters like earthquakes wreaking havoc. Despite all that, the Arabic words inscribed throughout the walls of Al-Hamra survived. Some of them were verses that used the first person, as if the building were referring to itself. As an example, on the right niche of an entrance, there is this poem, and the English translation goes like so. Quote, "All of art had offered me its beauty, giving me perfection and splendor. He who sees me imagines me at all hours, giving what the water jug seeks. When my beholder ponders my beauty, his visual perception causes his imagination to be deceived. Since so diaphanous I am that he sees the moon, its halo happily settles in me." End quote. Is it not completely comical? The building is a giant speech bubble, or a thought bubble, or your everyday narrator, I guess. Whichever way you decide to think of it, a body, whether human or otherwise, being both picture and text, is deeply vulnerable. It is perhaps even more so when there is no copy. It is its own singular comic standing alone in this world. The record of one's being and existence being carried in such a format feels like courting trouble. Maybe this is why we feel the need to make more than one copy of a comic to share. We wish to cement our creation and ourselves, even if our castle is constructed from copies of comic pages. Creating to be remembered and possibly revered conjures the image of pyramids, palm trees, and the calm waters of the Nile. And hey, ancient Egyptian artistic traditions are almost always brought up in historical discussions of comics. At least it feels like that, so I'll do it too. Let me dip my toes and ponder about the ancestors of a land I come from by letting our eyes wander at the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut. It is the tomb of Queen Hatshepsut from around the 15th century BCE and is located in the Theban necropolis of Deir el-Bahri in Egypt. After the short-lived enthusiasm of building pyramids faded, ancient Egyptian monarchs moved their burial grounds to the mountainous and naturally made pyramidal-looking terrain to lower expenses, or so I understand. And this is where Hatshepsut chose to be her resting place and where her people may have continued to worship and honor her. However, after her death, her successor was her stepson slash nephew, Thutmose III, who commanded her armies victoriously. Upon his ascension to the throne, he sought to erase her legacy and expunge her life from historical records. He went on a campaign to destroy mentions of her, or at least just enough that historians are in dispute over his reasons as to why. Thankfully, I'm not a historian, I'm an artist. And if I were to put myself in the sandals of a child who was too young to claim the throne, and thus his stepmother slash aunt essentially usurped it by acting as regent for nearly 20 years, and then I'm made to direct her armies when I came of age, and I did very, very well, I think the reason is as clear as a Saturday morning cartoon. Case closed. In all seriousness, Thutmose III is to be lauded in his own right. But his story will have to be for another project because I'm covering art, buildings, and comics. In that respect, it's important to mention that possibly during Thutmose's reign, the monarch stopped being addressed as king. They began to be referred to as pharaoh, which means great house in reference to the royal palace. And since we've been connecting comics and buildings, it makes me think about the relationship we have with architecture, privilege, and one's own existence. Who owns our spaces? Who owns our stories? If we have neither, do we even exist? And as we know, the tombs of ancient Egyptian are private places that function like one's own home in the afterlife. Their plunder has always struck me as distasteful. Imagine someone breaking down your walled-up door to grab your treasured teapot, most cherished clothes, and even your precious pet. The shudder that crawls along my back at the mention is the same one that writhes when I learned about graphic memoirs. Wait, what? Part 3, The Living Room. Sometime halfway through my undergrad, a visiting artist held a mini course in which we read and made graphic memoirs based upon our cultural origins. As I said before, I grew up reading comics that I seriously enjoyed. They even made me wish I had the power to control the elements, or meet a drunken captain to find treasure at the bottom of the sea. These were not the kind of comics that the class was about, of course. They were about serious subjects and empowerment of a different kind. What I recall from the required readings were the extracts that were taken from several books that describe familial strife, war, old grandma's gossip, war, shameful secrets, and war. My initial interaction with these books were tentative, as if I were made to hold a fragile artifact. This is someone's life, I thought. They were so important. We were being taught them in an academic environment, after all, and is that not a mark of substance and significance? And yet, I felt like a creepy voyeur. I read these memoirs as if I were excavating the tomb of Tutankhamun and bracing myself for the curse. Of course, unlike the dead, these authors chose to raid parts of their life and share it publicly. Does its personal nature cease then? Is it fair to scrutinize and criticize? Ah, tombs, graphic memoirs, and autobiographies are tough to talk about. Feels like an invasion on intimacy. I open graphic memoirs as if I were unburying bodies, and it's not like I know how. Upon self-reflection, even this talk feels like I'm shoveling the first layer of a grave to the side. Graphic memoirs may appear to be tombs, but I'd like to think that they're not how they appear to us in this universe, but the one in an ancient Egyptian's afterlife, brimming with life like a well-lived-in sitting room. Now, that's a much more inviting image, is it not? When you enter a narrative space, I suppose you choose whether you shall be a visitor or an intruder. Are you the pilgrim who enters the temple from the entrance and follows the passageways? Or are you the foreign plunderer who stoically invades from the boarded up exit and laments their lack of understanding? And this is where my initial discomfort with autobiography comics came from. I wasn't ready to be invited in. Reading comics is a highly interactive activity for me. It's the idea of walking through Borobudur or reading the walls of Alhambra. It's because comics house legacies and legends, not unlike Hatshepsut's temple. The spatial awareness between image and text never ceases, and I'm seized to be in it. At this point, I don't know where billowing stop and comics begin. I've confused myself. Maybe I can become a philosopher. Quote, for nothing was simply one thing, unquote. Virginia Woolf to the Lighthouse. Part 4, The Salon. Pulling examples from art history is tiring because there's a lot and my muscles are already screaming from exhaustion. If I must wrench another for the sake of this talk, let it be the Bayeux tapestry. This tapestry is technically not a tapestry as it's an embroidered piece of cloth, but hey, nitpicking. It consists of 58 scenes that describe the events that led to the Norman conquest of England in 1066. It is nearly 70 meters long and 50 centimeters tall. I first learned about it in primary school, elementary school for those in the US, where one expects it to remain untouched in the field of memories, and yet it keeps popping up in my life. It too seems to always be brought up when people talk about comics before comics. So if I'm bringing up textiles, I must bring up Faith Ringgold's story kilts. They too reside in my memory from a art history class. Her street story kilt is a triptych made from acrylic, ink marker, dyed fabric, and sequins on canvas, sewn to kilted fabric. Visually, you can see people living in an apartment building in Harlem. In the first section, residents witness a car accident. In the second, everyone is reduced to silhouettes as a fire rages. They reemerge in the end. However, above the grid of windows, handwritten text relays the life of a fictional character named AJ. The car accident is not just any car accident, it's the one that killed his mother and 4 uncles. AJ's father was the one who set the fire accidentally, and those who still remain in the building are emerging to look out at AJ, who has returned to the neighborhood as a successful writer and actor. The text adds context, huh? Textiles have a profound history for storytelling. Women spinning a good yarn as they wove tales and cloth, the patterns on Bedouin tents depicting places they've been, the cosplayer knitting clothes of their favorite characters. There's also a linguistic relationship between the words textiles and text in English. A small and reluctant thank you to an experimental stitching course in undergrad. The two words come from the Latin root word text, meaning woven. The other Romance languages likely exhibit a similar pattern. If reading comics is like turning corners, then I find creating comics to be like weaving a sweater. Storytelling, and by extension, comics, is an act in which one stitches themselves into the social fabric of time and space. I imagine panels as quilting that extends outwards into the world. Ringgold is quoted to have said, quote, during that time, I was trying to get my autobiography published, but no one wanted to print my story. In 1983, I began writing stories on my kilts as an alternative. That way, when my kilts were hung up to look at or photographed for a book, people could still read my stories, unquote. To be heard and preserved, this seems the crux of creation. Both Street Story Kilt and the Bayeux Tapestry were made to make someone accessible. Ringgold, William the Duke of Normandy, and I, who is adding text and image to this presentation for the exact same reason. There is powerful magic in combining the two, after all, as if the creation demands our attention, like opening up a portal with blinking lights. However, there's another ingredient in the so-called teleportation spell: tactility. We live in a decidedly digitized and terribly terrific age. While some of us still reminisce over turning pages, some may yet find themselves remembering the days when we scrolled down web pages because they'll have chips in their brains instead. Perhaps we're at a time when we are battling against tactility, to touch, to hold, to feel. Is touch not regarded as a primitive sense? This is how we cavemen maneuvered. This is how children still learn. This is what I do when I'm at the grocery store and picking vegetables and feel so unsophisticated that I can't tell a good shallot by sight. She has to touch and put her bacteria all over it. I feel the old lady snort. Tactility plays an important role in our lives. It's also an ingredient in my creativity that I can trace back to my grandparents' sitting room, which we call the salon in Egyptian Arabic, through French, very likely. Tapestry pieces were always hung and spanned the walls of the room. At my maternal grandparents' place, I distinctly recall that one showed an ambiguously East Asian court scene and another depicted a vague European tavern at night. I always wished I could touch them, but those ones were protected behind glass. At my paternal grandparents' place, my grandmother embroidered and did a lot of needlework herself, and so she hung up her pieces on the wall, and those had no glass. I would touch the bumps of yarn as I thought about the scene before me, a ship in treacherous waters and forever frozen in time and thread. Besides the tapestries, there were the intricately upholstered and very uncomfortable sofas and pillows, as well as the thick carpets with patterns that looked part labyrinthine and part serpentine. I didn't realize how much impact growing up in this environment would have until I started writing about it. It's on the carpeted ground and hard surfaces of chairs and cushions that I'd meet my first characters and stories. Those characters were plastic insects. I don't remember their names or what stories they led. I only know they resided back then and there in a place where folds were mountains, tufted patches were forests, and fringes were the end of the known world. There was one green butterfly whose wings always kept falling off, who'd be perched on a fancy cushion. The red dragonfly could be found in a similarly colored patch of red on the carpet. Curling leaves were walkways where the two troublemaking ants wandered down. The stag beetle's home was in the shadows under the sofa. She'd sometimes be placed guarding the plastic box they were all kept in. At the time, I was making do with what I had in hand. Now I see it as rudimentary engagement with map making, world building, and story plotting. Three things I enjoy to a fault. They're also the most difficult things for me to share, and now I know why. It harkens to something so young, so personal, and so raw. A notion I want to note: plot as in land, plot as in story, plot as in boundary. This childhood play of putting things in boxes is essential comics to me. Boundaries are everywhere, whether outlined and planned, curving and floral, haphazard and chaotic, or invisible and ignored. Accepting boundaries as intrinsic to comic making is not an easy one. Arguing for rules, lines, and boxes seems absolutely unpalatable. Let's give it a try before we say we don't like it, though. Part 5: The Kitchen. How does an artist speak about boundaries? Like a lorax speaking for the trees, like a devil whispering malice, or like a bird scolding a worm for getting up late? Let's go with all three. If we think of boundaries as boxes, then artists have had a long history with them. Many of us have heard the popularly spouted wisdom of think outside the box, as much as its inverse, that only within limitations can creativity truly thrive. Where do I stand on this? Well, when I was playing on the carpet, I was firmly within the box. No, And then I was putting things in. No, 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 no. I was taking things outside the plastic box and putting them in other boxes that weren't really boxes. So I was outside and across the box. Okay, I don't really know. Or rather, I don't want to realize that I know. A child's playpen is a harmless image. Boundaries, and by extension, the idea of containers, conjure up less savory kinds of boxes, though. Schoolrooms, prisons, coffins, display cases, and unopened gifts. So no wonder the idea of boundaries leave a bad aftertaste in our mouths. Do we want to read and make comics with those kinds of thoughts in our heads? At this point, I can try and wriggle out of the hole I've dug by claiming painters need not draw on rectangular canvases, comics need not be drawn in rectangular panels, and writers don't need to care about rectangular surfaces, I guess. I would have. That is until I came across the carrier bag theory of fiction by Ursula K. Le Guin. In the essay, she discusses the nature of storytelling by contrasting two distinct lines of technologies: the hunter's spear, knives, swords, and weapons, and the gatherer's baskets, sacks, and bundles. She argues to refocus our narratives from one that glorifies the hunter and killing to one that holds an exchange of being. Instead of heroes, write about people, since our first invention may very well have been a device to carry what we came across and not a tool for slaughter. Suddenly, containment isn't unsavory, containers are survival. Containers may be our earliest invention. It's the cradle of civilization, not the axe of civilization. And gourds were one of our earliest vessels, after all. And now do you see the madness I operate on when I planted the idea that comics are gourds at the beginning? Boxes are the gatherer's baskets, traveler's suitcases, or our own bedroom. For those that don't care for baskets, suitcases, or bedrooms, perhaps think about a glass of water on a particularly hot and dry summer's day, or a warm beverage on a wintry night. Instead of dismissing boundaries as antithetical to art, perhaps they are one of the most natural aspects. Even if we were to say swords make stories riveting, sheaths are still needed to carry the weapon. While Le Guin mainly centers on describing science fiction, a line she wrote seems too comic-like to pass by without mentioning, quote, "the womb of things to be and the tomb of things that were," unquote. Comics as happening now and holding on. The sentiment brings one back to the buildings I read as comics. It is what autobio comics are. It's what childhood play slash creative practice is. No matter how still the many moments are present in contained time. The comic artist has always known this deep down, and so we cherish our containers. We revel within them. Part 6. The English Classroom. Speaking of comics as containers, let me share something I've been holding on to close to my chest for a certainly long time. It's one of my earliest encounters with comics as a maker, much more traditional in sort than toys on carpets or historic buildings, I promise. In English class during my first year in secondary school, we were assigned to draw a scene from a piece of literature. I forget which it is, though. I want to say that it was Bridge to Terabithia, though it could have just been the Shakespearean play Much Ado About Nothing or Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Either one wouldn't be out of the question because the same teacher would definitely give us to read the Canterbury Tales from Chaucer by ourselves later that same year. Little did we know what we unleashed when we asked, "Miss, what does this word mean?" Let's say it was Bridge to Terabithia by Catherine Patterson because it's fitting. We're about to witness the death of innocence and childhood. Whichever scene I picked, I decided to adapt it into a series of panels and worked very hard on it. By that point, I was known as the art kid, so I had a reputation to consider. I started by lightly penciling in the lines. Then I spent time inking. Afterwards, colors and shading were meticulously added because that was the definition of hard work and good art in those days and in my head. Come on, inked and colored? The day we were to submit the assignment arrived, and I was shaking with anticipation. How eager I was to show my work to everyone. I sometimes wish I had that healthy dose of confidence and excitement. The world felt so ripe back then. I digress. When my friends and classmates peered over my shoulder to look at my work, their first, or at least what felt like their first, remark was, "Why are all their mouths closed?" I was mortified. There were speech bubbles, and they were pointing at characters who had their mouths closed. Was I too preoccupied with making the panels pretty that I didn't realize, or did I simply capture the moments when the characters had their mouths closed in speech? In any case, it felt like the dumbest mistake, a 6 plus 2 equals 9 kind of deal. If ever there was a stupid mistake in art, it felt like I had made it. When your audience is comprised of 13-year-old girls who pointed it out with a particular degree of exhilaration, it was easy to immediately feel like a wildebeest migrating in the wrong direction. Don't worry, in recalling this incident, I grinned a lot more than the humiliation pained me at the time. Most of these friends went on to become economists, political scientists, dentists, psychologists, or interior designers. So that's fitting and makes a lot of sense. But I've become an artist, so I can't always seek to fit in and make sense. Questioning new possibilities is an occupational necessity. Part 7: The Study. Speaking of memories and intellect, did you know that our minds may operate like a comic book? I came across this notion that the brain functions like one by mapping things in space. As I previously said, I'm an artist, and that fact hasn't changed yet, so it will not come as a surprise when I say I'm not a neurologist either. And so I have no authority to determine whether or not the information is accurate. I'd like it to be true, though, because it makes comic artists and readers like mind hoppers. Although, once upon a time, not too long ago, if I didn't get into art school, I was going to throw my lot in with medicine. On that note, let me share another anecdotal story relating to something comic-like. This time, how I used comics to learn without realizing it throughout my schooling. When I was in secondary school, I came across the idea of people with photographic memory. I don't think I'm one of these people. Besides, what I took away was this. What if I made my notes as pretty as a picture? Would I not remember the information better? Like a medieval monk, I would have multiple manuscripts, see textbooks, open and synthesize them into my own codex, see notes. I used everything from colored pens, highlighters to pencils and markers for my own hand-drawn diagrams. Instead of the patterned carpets and toys of my childhood, a lined notepad and office stationery were my tools as a studious adolescent, which feels just a little bit sad to say in hindsight. Did my efforts work? I will let you be the judge. During a mock for a final biology exam, we had to identify this thing inside the villi, which are like little projections found all over the intestines to help absorb food, and which I couldn't remember. I froze for a few seconds, but then my brain said, put down lymph vessel. And so I did, and moved on. Oh, let me move on actually. When I looked back through my notes after the exam, I discovered that I had written down under its specific name, lacteal, that it's a lymph vessel. And so lymph vessel turned out to be correct, and most importantly, an acceptable answer in the answer sheet. Possibly is was all just luck, but maybe there is something to my theory about pretty study notes, and perhaps our minds do function like comics, and I had unlocked a way to load more pages into it. Or if you permit me the analogy of a mind palace, then I had navigated it like the historic structures I have come to read as parallel to comics later on in my life. Perchance. Part 8: The Sidewalk. It's an opportune time now to talk about something I've encountered in the making of this talk and has led me to present this presentation the way I'm presenting it. As per the laws of the universe, when you try to find something, you will not. I looked everywhere for my school notes, especially since I was at my parents' place during the summer, where they'd likely be. All I got from my searching was a paper cut on my dominant hand's middle finger where the skin meets the nail. This was a sign. My body spoke to me as if it were Alhamra. Be you, be an artist, use what you have. And so I did. I relied on recreations, translations, and memories. And I know memories are such an untouched topic in the arts. I say with all the sarcasm one can muster. Part 9, The City. When I began by observing comics and architecture, I thought the obvious conclusion to reach was to suggest comic creation as a modern day counterpart to urban development. Come on, aren't layout sketches blueprints akin to gridded blocks? Sure, if you want to be a bit more forward, we can have a natural looking park boundary to offset the squares. Really, though, what was becoming obvious to me was that living in big cities has made me see the world as ripe for paving. Subconsciously, I internalize that areas and their allocation are meant to fit like a jigsaw puzzle. I wanted to make a case for cities as containers, comics, and call upon the graffiti on the streets of Cairo, Columbus, Pompeii, and more to act as witnesses for my argument. It would come out completely contrived, though. Reading comics is different from creating them, and both processes are very different from what comics actually mean to me. So, comics don't mean city-like, urban, or equivalent to civilization to me, or not entirely, at least. This is when I encountered a realization unexpectedly by looking back at one of the most urbanized places I've lived in. Part 10, The Ocean and the Sea. Around the age of 7, I moved and grew up in the coastal city of Doha in Qatar. Before the rapid and large-scale urbanization that I was there to witness, and before the country gained independence from the British Empire in 1971, it thrived on pearl divers who would jump into the waters of the Gulf Sea and contend with white sharks while searching for oysters. You can find this history in the several Qatari names that reference pearls. Dana is the name of the larger pearls, Lulwa for the medium-sized pearls, Gumasha is for the smallest and tiny pearls. When I went to school there, I would come to know many Danas, a couple of Lulwas, and only one Gumasha, who was the one to teach me what all three of those words and names mean. There's an abundance of pearl metaphors out there in the world. After all, pearls are an interesting container of creation, sitting amidst the smooth rocks in a seabed and making pearls out of irritants, like parasites and particles, is strangely kindred to the spirit of artists making comics from the struggles of everyday life and the horrors of the world around us. I sense the ghost of graphic memoirs running a cold finger down my spine. I will hold its hand and give it a pearl as I tell it a tale of my own. In another universe, I may have shut the door on this. Even though I've lived a considerable amount of my life in Qatar, I don't have the strongest grasp on the Arabic language. I can speak it casually and read it slowly. I can even write it when I really, really have to. But it's not comfortable. It feels like wearing an ornate hand-me-down dress from my grandmother. And if I had one, it would be kept in the closet. It's because after kindergarten, my entire schooling was at a British international school. We were forced to speak English at all times, which was reason to be because the students were coming from all over the world, and the only way to stop anyone from being alienated was to speak the common tongue, English. Besides, we only had Arabic class once a week. Nothing will replace the lost time. And so it's this language I learned to speak, read, and write, as if it were a body part grafted on me, and I grew to accept. When I went into painting and printmaking in undergrad, the rebellious art student in me made the decision to refrain from putting any English in my creative work. I still wrote essays for my liberal arts classes, and I wrote a lot of essays, but I kept them fairly separate from my artistic practice. Even though I loved writing and stories and poems, I suddenly stopped. The books and theories I was reading in art history made me frustrated. How could I possibly use the language spoken by an empire on which the sun never sets? It didn't help that I stumbled upon the Codex Seraphinianus by Luigi Serafini during that time. It is a colorfully illustrated encyclopedia of a fictional world written in an imaginary language. The library at my undergrad had a copy, and I would go into that restricted section and peruse it several times throughout my time there. And so I made up writing scripts too. People found them cool, which bolstered me. It's like a mix between Arabic and English. And this way I was shielded from questions like, why don't you write in Arabic? Or why are you writing in English? I was doing both and neither. What a code I had cracked. However, I was soon told by my American professors that my work was opaque and very distanced. It confused me. What else am I to do? It's not like I have other options. You wouldn't understand Arabic, and I don't know it well enough to write anything of quality in it. You may wonder if the class on graphic memoirs and that we had to write one helped reconcile my relationship with English. It strangely hadn't, because at that point I wanted to be a serious painter, not a funny cartoonist. Little did I know that I didn't know what I wanted, because it would be another comics class later in my life that would. Wink, wink. One day, I came across this quote from author Yi-Yoon Lee's article titled "To Speak is to Blunder," in which he states it is, quote, "It is hard to feel in an adopted language, yet it is impossible in my native language," unquote. This was in an answer to a doctor who asked her, quote, "If you can be articulate about your feeling, or about your thoughts, why can't you articulate your feelings?" Unquote. The reality is, my first language is neither English nor Arabic. It's French, which I have to thank for my lisp and inability to say the R in my name. We won't talk about French. I will never feel in English as I wish to feel. It's an artificial limb I have attached, while I remain inaccessible to the language of my heart, the one I love for in good nights you wish people to wake to goodness. You wish peace upon people when you enter the room, and they respond by wishing peace, mercy, and blessings in return. Still, English is the one I've got in my brain, so it's my language now, and I can use it to say what I need. To go back to oysters, I think I was like one who refused to open itself. I could not make pearls, not even small, wonky, and flawed ones. Of course, you may suggest that comics don't need to have writing at all. They can be comprised of glyphs, symbols, and solely rely on imagery. What's the use of words? Pictures are more fun anyway. However, I love words. I love how they look, sound, and the connections you can make between them. Actually, the connections, common roots that I'm actually referring to are something I don't usually connect to English. These roots make up the vast network of Arabic, and they remain rooted in my brain. For me, comics as a series of containers makes the English-speaking quarters of my brain squirm in discomfort. As mentioned earlier, containers may remind us of boxes, and boxes bring up things like prisons and coffins. However, my Arabic-speaking forest is alive and brimming with noise. Let's investigate. To me, containers, and by extension comics, are connected to the ocean, which hasn't always been the case. It's a fairly recent discovery on my part. However, take everything I'm about to say with a giant swig of salty ocean water. Bottoms up. The word for ocean in Arabic is muhit. It shares a similar root word with the word for wall, ha'it. It was strange to me that a language practiced by mercantile and traveling people saw the ocean as akin to walls, as if it were not traversable. They sailed and traded down in Africa and as far as Southeast Asia. They were even infamous pirate bays in the Gulf. But the word for ocean in Arabic also shares the root word for surround, ihata, as well as for provision, ihtiyat, which makes sense when one considers how the Arabian Peninsula is surrounded by water from nearly all sides. However, we have another word for sea in Arabic, it's bahr, and it shares its root with interesting words like navigation and any word about sailing, as well as a word that is used to mean free, bahari. Instead of constricting containers waiting to confine and cage, I find comics as boundaries containing free moving and fluid material, where one can sail, swim, and fish. I may read comics as if I were a pilgrim turning around the corners of a temple, or as a guest sitting at the coffee table of someone's living room. And when I'm making comics, I may be knitting a long chain of sweaters. However, comics are still containers, and there's no more romantic way of putting it. The pilgrim is swept around the temple, the guest bobs along on the sofa. My creativity is in a sea of carpet, and I flounder in its folds. Part 11, The Stairwell. I have opened an overly shaken can of soda with this comic talk. Was I not a toddler rattling a toy, or simply picking at a nasty scab, or just shaking a carbonated can? That'll do. I've talked about walking around comics, holding comics, learning from comics, but have I looked into the drinkable qualities of comics? Perhaps not fully, but I'm getting sidetracked again. Let us go back to the main road where we can hope to find each other to the stroke of inspiration that made us pick up wet clay slabs and pull out reeds to write things down. Connect to the information contained in those tablets, the tablets held by humans, the buildings that stored humans, the land that possessed the building, and the land carried in my mind, into the screen that holds all this. After all, for this talk at least, I like to think I've been a single panel on a screen. Look, I didn't say I'd be a good philosopher. Okay, okay, I'll stop. I must find a way to stop. There needs to be an end in sight, right? Uh, um, let's say the clock has struck midnight. And so, in conclusion, the biggest surprise I've encountered in comics is that they're a constant in my life. Even when I think they're not for me, they show up in my life like Cinderella's carriage and whisk me away. Oh, and would you look at that? Here's another reason comics are gourds. All right. Thank you for joining me on to more adventures and rantings, ravings, and reflections. Thank you. And go to the Zoom.
Hi, Yara. Wow. Well, I'm very blown away that you wrote an entire book for this presentation and drew it, and just how many incredible thoughts you put into this hour that you shared with us here. We are very lucky to have you here and to get to hear your thoughts and see them, and also your just lovely reading performance of that was really incredible. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. Um, Now it is Q&A time. So I invite anyone here to, if you want to write a question for Yara in the chat, you may do so. If you'd rather just like speak it out loud to Yara yourself, if you want to do the little like raised hand emoji, you can do that. And then we can ask you to say it out loud and you can discuss. It looks like there's one that popped up here in the chat. The question is, you expressed being uncomfortable when reading autobiocomics. Do you feel the same way when reading an autobiography, like a book, or seeing a biopic as a movie? Do you think comics are somehow more intimate? Really interesting question.
Yeah, superb. Thank you so much for that question. My goodness. My first impulse is to say yes, do feel more intimate. Things like movies, I think that there's this whole like maybe a reading or something about it where basically stuff like movies are kind of far away from us, right? Especially if we're seeing them in the cinema, the screen is far away. But as you get more intimate, like for instance, YouTube videos on our phones, they get closer to us. Suddenly it's in our hands. And if it's in a screen, like it gets closer and therefore, we'll feel more connected. With comics, however, I think, you're either holding it in your hand or you're just really close to it and you're reading it and seeing the visuals. And maybe it's speaking to bits of your mind. And so, yes, I do feel like when I was reading and, still read autobio comics, I do feel kind of like I've been swept into someone's living room and I'm like, okay, here, my life. And I'm like, ah. Um, Whereas with a movie, I feel like I'm watching from like outside the window. It's like, oh, okay. I'm far away from you. And then, with a book, there's no drawings in them. Ew. No, I feel like they also maybe are more kind of like, I don't know, what would be the best analogy with the living room outside the window situation? I don't know. Maybe it feels like I'm at the front door and kind of invited and I'm like allowed. I'm just having a chat outside. But yeah, thank you so much for that question. Ooh.
Um, and the response is, love your answer. Thank you. I'll have to look up the stuff Scott McCloud wrote about those holding a comic up close to sorry, holding a comic up close versus watching something further away, etc. Um, I have a question. Well, I have a bunch of questions. I took a lot of notes, but I want to encourage others to write their questions in the chat and continue the Q&A from the audience. But in terms of like intimacy and thinking about the intersection of architecture and books and book structures are something that I know you have been really engaged with and curious about and use in your work. different kinds of binding methods and histories and structures and thinking about how those affect the process of reading a narrative and really activating that aspect of a physical book and how that affects like how we navigate it. It feels so connected to thinking about moving through space and parallels with different architecture. Could you talk a little bit about that in your practice and how you think about that in your current work?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess back to that kind of analogy of like a mind palace. And so for me, especially when I'm making like work, just trying to generate ideas or negotiate with myself, it's easiest when I first of all work by hand. I rarely do I just immediately jump to the digital. It's always by hand and making little books that I can then turn and open in different ways because then I'm able to respond to it like as a physical space. And it's also more fun. Again, I think it's kind of been liberating in a sense to kind of always to bring back childhood play into the process where it feels like those back in those stories where they portal fantasies, right? Where it's like, okay, I'll go into this book, but I'm going into a book inside a book, and unlocking something. And so definitely when I'm making work, whether it's even for this talk, it first began as like literally just thumbnails on bits of pieces of paper, thoughts, stringing thoughts together on post-it notes and kind of placing them in some fashion, almost again, kind of creating a little city, I guess, to bring back analogy and metaphors. And then seeing, oh, should I put this thing beside this thing, or would it be better over here? Again, maybe hearkening to childhood play, or just something that I feel is kind of comes innate, that it's like working by hand and trying to visualize, especially thoughts and things that are perhaps very kind of metaphysical and kind of can be not tangible, um, into something that is material. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Any other questions from the virtual crew here? If so, let it be known in the chat or otherwise. Otherwise, I'll just keep asking questions, but would love to hear from some of the people I know here. I know are capable of asking great questions. Let's see. Anna Perna asked a question here. This was so fantastic, Yara. I I am wondering if you are working on a comic now, and if so, what it's about. I'm also curious if you're working on creative work that isn't a comic. You mentioned tapestry and embroidery and rugs, and I would love to see what your version of any of those might be.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you, Anna. I know like you're an amazing you make tapestries, you make kilts, which is pretty awesome. I've been seeing them. They're awesome. First of all, thank you so much for being here. Um, so first of all, I'm as much as I'm like laud, like, oh, working by hand and getting things like in order and making little booklets and stuff. I feel like I have the clumsiest fingers. I would never trust myself with like needles. Yeah, sure, I did an experimental stitching class, but I do not trust myself with these things. I always feel like, I, that's why I'm some like, even though I'm like, oh wow, traditional things, I still kind of appreciate the digital world too, because I get to be clean about things at the end. So I don't know. I'm a riddle, aren't I? But let's see if I'm working on something. Well, currently. I mean, so currently, teaching and balancing work and stuff. I making this comic has shown me that it's possible, and I'm working on I'm like just 24 pages left of a long issue chapter, but I'm currently working on a web comic called Court Comicals. And it's much more on the funny, humorous side, but touches on satire as well. It's about a royal court painter dealing with want to keeping his job in a, let's say, world where the economy and monarchies are falling apart. So anyway, so if you like my sense of humor, give it a read. I'll be releasing the third issue soon. Um, so that's what I was is currently like taking up my thoughts beyond, of course, this talk. Yeah, no, I mean, pause there. But yeah, thank you. Um,
Let's see, let's go over to the chat. There's a comment here. Beyond your thoughtful, imaginative, and challenging story, I greatly admire your adept page layout designs, which enhance your narrative. Visually very attractive and elegant. Thank you, from Michael. Um, Thanks for that comment. I agree. Um, Sarah writes, I'm a very big fan of your work. When you are planning your work, how do you decide which projects to turn into films and which ones to gear towards comics? Does accessibility after production affect this plan? Also, I really resonate with your analogy to play.
Oh wow, thank you for all that. Um, let's see. So how do I decide how a project turns out? I think it's often the format. I often like to think that the format should um support the story as best as it possibly can, which is sometimes maybe why we often feel like adaptations are never as good as the original because the original was the best version that it could be. And I think the best adaptations translations are always like what new things can be offered with this new medium or this new mode of storytelling. And so I often like to think about whether a project, like it's intrinsic and sort of like when the idea pops up, it's like almost it can't be untied from what mode of work it's going to be. So I I know it feels like such a weird, bad answer that it's like, well, it is what it is. But I feel like I think if there is a pause, like a millisecond pause that happens in the mind, and I think it does, it's just thinking, what is the best mode to storytell this, whatever I want to say. So for instance, I think with comics, perhaps it's the idea that you can go like the pages, the turning of the pages, or I mean, it depends, I guess, on the feeling, but like the fact that you could be able to see panels, both the past and the future, in the same page, and thinking about how that lends itself to the storytelling versus something like an animation where it's like you're kind of like, let me sweep you into this world and trust that you remember things that are happening. I think the other thing too that I've been thinking a lot more about is that with my animations, they're usually, interestingly enough, they don't really have dialogue in them. They're much more of an emotional thing, very image heavy, as opposed to comics where I feel like I'm able to just kind of like, here's my words and putting it out there. So that's another thing that I've been thinking about and whether and how kind of potentially a project that would bridge that gap for me, like kind of like a creative journey. There would be this little um, threshold where I'm able to find, oh, a project that kind of balances between the two. But yeah, hopefully that answers it. Thank you.
Um, yeah. Let's see. We have another question here. Yara, this was such an amazing, insightful, and inspiring talk. I loved your analogy describing comics as the ocean. You also describe comics as containers. My question is, both metaphors are so different. One is free and fluid, and the other is restricted and stiff. How do you make sense of your concept of comics between those two seemingly opposite metaphors? Do you lean more towards one or the other? Or perhaps they live in balance simultaneously in your mind. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Mason. It's so good that you're here and talk. Thank you. Um, so this is the thing. I think oceans are containers. That's where that's the secret is that I find them, I think that the way that we think of them as like muhit, like surrounding, that they are a container. And that this container, what we, often I think, again, yeah, the ocean usually for us is like, oh, open space, it's so open, but at the end of the day, it's still containing something, no matter how vast it is. And that's what I think comics are for me, um, at the end of the day. So, uh, so yeah, so I think that's the connection there, that oceans are containers. So, and I think, yeah, I'll stop there. I answered it.
Wonderful. Let's see. I have another question. I'm curious about your current the place you're currently teaching and working and your kind of observations of that place in terms of comics and the culture of comics there. So you're currently living in Columbus, Ohio, um, and teaching there. And there's such a blossoming scene there with cartoon Crossroads Columbus. There's a lot of cartoonists that live there and work there. And there's also the incredible resource of the Billy Ireland Library that as someone who does both animation and comics, it's really just such a gem to have sitting there, like huge pile of like original drawings from Gertie the dinosaur, one of the first, animations, and also all these original pages from all kinds of histories of comics. And it's just a really incredible course there. And I just want to hear about your engagement with the city. I think you've been there like 1 year or two at this point, but just
Going on two now.
okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
What is
So
it to work in comics and also teach comics then?
yeah. Well, I teach animation,
Okay.
so
Yeah.
yeah, but I will. I mean, I think I have one of my students here. I also teach color scripts, which, it was gonna open a whole can of worms if I were to, because I had a section where I was like, oh, color scripts, we could think of them as like an experimental form of comics. But then I was like, we're gonna open a can of worms because people are, well, could get to like, are maybe color scripts are more like film strips than comics. And I don't know, there's an energy I get sometimes whenever mentioning like, oh, comics could be awesome storyboards for animation. I'd be like, no, comics are their own thing. And I'm like, but they could be. It's an experimental storyboard. It could really lend itself nicely if possible. But anyway. I mean, this is where it's like the Columbus is such an interesting place that it's like to me that's like I'm like, wait, this exists. That it is like I would never have known that the Billy Ireland is about the Billy Ireland Museum and knowing CXC and prominent, comics con that happens I just happened actually last month. And I got to, visit the Metropolitan Library Museum and seeing comics almost being sold in this sort of marketplace is such an awesome atmosphere to feel, especially since how digitized again the world is. Feels like everything is kind of far removed. Um, but let's see. And then as in terms of again where animation and comics meet, part of the CXC event was a screening, and my film screened in it, which was awesome. And I'd even say like something like the film that screened in it, which was A Snake Called Perseus. A lot of people bring up Mobius in terms of the inspiration of comic artists, also worked in animation. But I'd also say, Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind by Hayao Miyazaki is also an inspiration if anyone's plotting the family tree. Um, so yeah, let's see. So it's been a while, but I think that the to kind of conclude the answer, one of the things about Columbus is that it feels like it's out of the 80s for me, and I certainly have not lived in the 80s. I only know it from Hollywood films, and so to me, it's like, oh, this is what it is like, right? It's like people like will give you stickers. There's people like on skateboards, graffiti on the walls, like public art things. There's a pierogi place nearby the school, and it's like, wait, whoa, this feels. What is this place? And the comic CXC Cartoon Crossroads Columbus. That's the thing. Like I feel like I'm very fortunate to have come across this place and the people that are, again, some people here from Columbus, and it's been it feels very special to be here as both someone who works in comics and animation. But there is that tension, is there not, between the two sometimes, because like we're our own thing. But I feel like the two processes sometimes undeniably end up together. Like when I was making some of the panels for this talk, I probably made them with the mindset of an animator. And maybe sometimes I don't often think of myself again as an animator slash comic artist. I just think artist, and that's it. The medium, I can work in whatever medium and story mode. Anyway, that was a long answer. I'll pause here.
That's great. I love your take on the 80s. I would love to hear a little bit more about A Snake Called Perseus, your animation, since you mentioned it here, and that is a pretty major work that you made. You completed it about 2 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, could you tell us a little bit about that film, and is there a way to view it online, or is it?
Um, Probably very soon. I'll release it to into the wild. So be on the lookout for that. Currently, there's the trailer for anyone who's curious about it. So it's a 10-minute short film. It pretty much, I think, in terms of the kind of projects I'm doing, is very like what you saw here today was someone who's very kind of like open and here, let's talk about all of this and put things to words. The film is much more vague and mysterious and is much more about you thinking of things and what the story is going on. So it's a for anyone who hasn't encountered it, it's basically a story about a snake who travels through the desert trying to eat something, specifically trying to connect to this butterfly, chasing after a butterfly. What happens? Watch it and you'll find out. Um, but a lot of the film came from, first of all, my like interaction with the myth of Medusa, which, the title of the film is a snake called Perseus. Um, so it was a deconstruction of the myth and sort of thinking about, okay, what can I do with it? And again, a lot of the process was came from like comic making, a lot of books and panels and all that sort of stuff. And the style of it, the stippling effect, it just was from my own drawings. I usually don't like to sketch. I don't sketch at all in pencil. It's ink immediately. The reason for that is so that, first of all, because I try not to treat the drawings as precious, and I know that I'll go back and try to make them perfect. If I'm working in ink, I have to just commit to those lines and respond to it as well, and just keep moving forward. So the style of it became what it is. So if you, I mean, currently on my Instagram, you'll see some of the recent posts. There are colored like little illustrations from a snake called Perseus back when the story was very different. And those were done in ink. And exactly as mentioned, there's just no pencil, just directly ink, and I just colored them digitally. But so that's the process that I used to make it, and the style again came from that process. And so the ink like illustrations, the clean line style, was from drawing on paper. And sure, I did ended up doing digitally completely for feasibility, but yeah, the project, it's been a very interesting film in terms of like if I were to just kind of keep you updated, Lily, about it. It feels like a film that is when it finds its audience, people connect to it, which is interesting to me always. But it's certainly it's its own little beast for me. I'll pause there.
Um, uh, well, if there's any, are there any other questions? Now would be the time to pop them in the chat. But yeah, otherwise, um, Yara, this was a really incredible presentation. I feel like within the container of this symposium, it is overflowing and bursting and swirling around. You really put so many ideas into this and so much um, just beautiful artistry and thought. It's really, really generous of you to have shared this with us. And I want to point out to all that this will be archived on the YouTube page for the symposium, which is a really great way to see past talks. It's, I think, a really special aspect, again, of the accessibility of this symposium that people can see it whenever, and it can kind of live there. And there's just so much to rewatch with this one too. I feel like I want to revisit and move through all of your ideas because there's just so many in there that you shared with us. So thank you so, so much. Um, I want to also just say the next, where is it? I have it written down somewhere. The next symposium event will be next Tuesday, but it will be live. It'll be in person at the New School at 7 p.m. Eastern, and you can find more info on the symposium WordPress site. It'll be Eli Valley. So check that out. And thank you everyone so much for coming and for your thoughtful questions and comments for Yara. And Yara, of course, thank you so much. This was amazing.
Thank you, Lily. Thank you so much.
All right. Bye, everyone.